Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Everyday Muslim. If you like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe and share it with your friends and family. If you like to support it, go to patreon.com/emuslimpodcast. We also have an audio-only version of this podcast for if you're on the go. You can check it out at anchor.fm/everydaymuslim. All the links will be in the video description. Lastly, thank you so much for all of your support.
Assalamu alaikum, Imam John. How are you doing today?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we're blessed, can't complain.
Yes, alhamdulillah. So, from this episode forward, we're kind of moving, from a shift to, interview style, seerah, learning through questions and answers, to, more of a discussion-based, analysis of, current events that are going on. So, today we're actually going to be discussing the Boulder, Colorado shooting that just happened, what was it, a few days ago or a week ago now? So yeah, just what are your initial thoughts and insights?
Yeah, in terms of the Boulder shooting, the facts are there, and I think that as a Muslim community, we're blessed in that the broad mainstream media as well as the law enforcement are not using the word Muslim or terrorist because he's a murderer. And so when they look at his history, they find things that, are related to people who have anger problems and mental health issues. And so that's the reality of it. So it's a big blessing that the broader mass media, law enforcement has matured to not create this, havoc and concern about, the witch hunt of Muslims.
Yeah, normally we see, even if it's not a Muslim associated with a terror organization or whatever, it's just a plain murderer, they'll still try to somehow tie that in there and kind of increases Islamophobia or whatever, the misunderstanding of Islam. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, when we look at Myanmar and China and India, I think they're seeing the real repercussions of normalizing the threat of Islam and Muslims nonsense.
And while this doesn't tie into this current event, I do find it interesting, since you brought it up in China, the whole Uyghur concentration camps that they have. I find it interesting that many countries are actually finally beginning to acknowledge that something is happening there. I think the Dutch just did it, and Canada, and did the U.S. do it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even under Trump, Mike Pompeo was designating this as an act of cultural genocide and terror against the people, the Uyghur community. And really the whole hang-up on all of this is economic influence.
But I find it interesting that the U.S. is usually so tied up in advocating freedom for people in other countries that that's what brought them to Vietnam and so many other wars. But since they have economic interests in China and whatever, they can't exist without China. They can't really do much about it, in terms of sanctions or even warfare. So
yeah.
So back to the Boulder, Colorado incident. I did find it interesting that how it did shift attention away from what happened in Georgia. That was the big thing on the news. And you did mention right before we started how we all view it as a racially motivated attack, but you can actually see it from a different paradigm. So could you elaborate on that?
So yeah, as a Muslim, we are told in the Quran, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. So there's an ayah in Surah Al-Isra that says, don't follow and don't present yourself based on knowledge that you're not sure about, that you don't have sound knowledge. إِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. Surah Al-Najm, that suspicion and assumption, it is not sufficing with God against the truth in the least bit. And there are many other ayahs. Perhaps I think the largest, most consequential ayah is from Surah Al-Ma'idah, كُونُوا قَوَّامِينَ لِلَّهِ شُهَدَاءَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اِعْدِلُوا. So the ayah is saying that, O you who believe, stand up for Allah's sake as people who are firmly rooted in the truth and speak out for justice. And so the caveat is warning us of bias. It's natural. Human beings are filled with bias. We have our experience, our tribe, our environmental conditioning, and we have all these biases that are naturally part of us. So it says, do not allow your hatred or dislike of people to make you be unjust in judgment about them. So on this thing, if we look actually, what do we know in terms of actual facts of the Atlanta shooter? What we know is that he was raised in a very hardline, right-wing religious family. His dad was a pastor at an evangelical church. And he was growing up, he heard about how sex is evil and bad. Turns out this guy ended up with a pornography addiction. He's watching pornography for hours on end. He became into sex addiction. While it's wrong and racist to say that the Asian massage parlors are places of sex work, because, that's just not a widespread fact, there is a common known thing that does exist in many places, where you can go to these places and then they will offer you something above the legal massage offer. And so this guy is claiming that he had that problem and that he became overwhelmed in his sinful guilt, and he went and shot all these ladies as an act of retaliation against his sinful desires, and these are his temptations and so forth. So the guy doesn't have any history of promoting or claiming white supremacy or hating all Asian people. You just don't see that. It's not part of anything, that he was doing. So the very aggressive, no questions asked, this is white supremacy and racism and Asian hate, I don't think that's a fair assessment. And that's not to belittle or undermine the very terrible, sad, horrific loss and pain that the people who were murdered are going through. And of course, this guy is a murderer, and he should be accountable, but we need to be careful, particularly as Muslims, supporting this, agenda-based blame game, rather than just first saying, well, this is a human being who took the decision to go murder a bunch of people. Let's first keep it like that. And if the facts prove that this guy is in white supremacy or some radical jihadist character, then we accept that and deal with it, right? But I don't think it's doing any good. There's a Glenn Greenwald is the one of the founders of The Intercept, one of the most well-known and high-quality investigative journalist platforms. And he was actually the one that Edward Snowden contacted, and he won the Pulitzer Prize over his work with Edward Snowden in helping keep everything under wraps until they had all the information, and then spreading it out to all the different outlets so that it couldn't be stopped. And so it was very effective what he did. And he's known historically to be very progressive and open-minded. So he said that I don't know why everybody's, in chorus here about something that we have no factual evidence to claim this guy's a white supremacist. So now what's interesting is you'll see people who have always praised him and lauded his accomplishments. Now they're saying, it looks like Greenwald is going with some sort of right-wing agenda now for something about his career. And even the guy from the Young Turks, he said, you see people going to different political angles for money or whatever, but then he caught himself because he knows Glenn is above that and there's no evidence of it. I'm not saying Glenn, is taking money from the right, but we can clearly see he has another agenda that is guiding his work. How come it can't just be that the guy still is the way he always was, but he's challenging a very common liberal left-wing narrative of the event?
Well, we can still say that it's possible that he had that kind of Asian hate kind of thing that's going on. And to address that as a real issue, it reminds me of something interesting I saw around a year ago. A comedian on YouTube, Ryan Higa, he made a skit about Asian hate, right? Because he's I believe he's Chinese American, and so he was playing this satirical white Southern character, and he was and to make the coronavirus go away, if I see an Asian person, I gotta beat him up. And he was it was a joke, but there's people that are actually doing stuff like that, and that's just crazy.
No, definitely over the last year, some massive spikes in anti-Asian hate, and there always has been. We've been brainwashed. I mean, China has its very massive human rights issues, as we see with the Uyghur population as well. But there is a notion that could easily be called brainwashing, that anything that's not capitalist, so-called democracy, is evil and bad, and you kind of grow up here feeling that there's something wrong with being Chinese, right? That this is not a capitalist, democratic, free country.
And that can be applied to other like new ideas as well. Like, for example, when Bernie Sanders was advocating for free healthcare, everyone's like, "Oh, communist." It's like now communist is like evil, or And though it is not a perfect system, it's not exactly like. It was a joke I saw in like this video about the Cold War, and they were saying that like in what year was that around?
The Cold War was back in the 70s, 80s.
Yeah, so they were saying that around the 70s when that was going on, whenever someone saw something bad, they would say communist. Oh, it's rainy outside, communist kind of thing. So
exactly,
it's kind of turned into something like that, and like China, like blame it on China.
I mean, in Oklahoma, it was very common to hear anti-Asian, the language that people use and things like that, and that's evil and wrong. And as Muslims, obviously, we're totally against all of that. But I just feel, considering how we've been going through 20 years of Muslim or Middle Eastern person has done something wrong, or even is being accused of doing something wrong, and there has not been a trial or any evidence or any factual proven, and then everything on the media, the mainstream media for 20 years was Arab, Muslim, jihadist, ISIS, extremist. And so I think it's a reasonable concern to say, should we jump on the bandwagon of any time a white person kills a bunch of people, that we should immediately jump to white supremacy without any evidence?
Right. And before we fully go back to the main topic, I think that this like ties into like Islam and like Muslims and how we live in general, but with the whole like Asian hate thing, that like you notice that I feel like Hollywood and like just movies and media has contributed a lot, and also to the anti-Muslim image. Like I believe it was the movie American Sniper, or even like just like small things in like Marvel movies. You see like the terrorists in Black Panther were apparently Muslims or whatever. Wallahi, I'll shoot her. That's what he said, I think.
Don't move, I will shoot. Wallahi, I will shoot her right.
And then like there's a lot of like, if you see some movies from the 90s that have like Chinese people in it, you're like, people used to watch this, right? It's like racist. It's just flat out racist. So I feel like media and like movies have like played a huge role in like anti-Muslim or anti-Asian sentiment. So yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting is, while you'll find among a lot of immigrant Muslims kind of a feeling of, well, there's freedom here, there's a way for me to make some money and get a good opportunity and give my kids an education, but you can just tell that they have this kind of vibe that America is immoral or liberal or whatever, or it supports Israel and dictatorships in the Muslim world for so long. But also they did take from this colonialist reality they faced certain attitudes of racism that they learned from the colonialists. And so it's very important. The idea of objectivism is very difficult. And there's a couple of books. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And I think, anyone who reads that book will start to see his own stories. He's a decorated psychologist in the field of, it's almost like sociological, like how the collective of people become because of how individuals think. Right? So putting psychology in with sociology. And that's kind of like his forte. So before he really, really got deep into this work, he found himself growing up very liberal. That's his own story. But he said the more he started studying this and the more he started applying what he's learning and the different mechanisms and data, he started realizing that there are many things that if he thinks from just a straight moral, personal cause and effect, benefit versus harm, there are many very valuable ideas coming from people who call themselves conservative. And there are many problematic and harmful things that we are just kind of programmed to constantly say as a liberal that actually have proven to be harmful and unhelpful for solving the problems they claim to be solving or supporting the causes they claim to support. And even Malcolm X, you know, he made a big strong point about that, about the white American liberal is like the worst enemy, you know. And so I think as Muslims, it's a hard task. We find ourselves here in this country where Democrats have said, yeah, we welcome you in. You know, you're oppressed people, you're a minority, you know, war is bad, you know. So there's a large contingency where in the Democrat Party we feel like, but we have to be very careful to know that Democrat and Republican is an engineered methodology of control of the political framework of this country. There is a very good reason why those two have massive amounts of billions of dollars, and any third party, which there are many, many third parties if you look into it that have come up over the last 30, 40 years, and none of them have ever achieved anything.
This is a side point, but I find it interesting that, like, since they've been founded, the Democratic and Republican parties have, like, seemed to have almost switched ideologies in a sense. Like, what was then, like, the Democratic candidate at the time of, like, Lincoln was not advocating for freeing slaves or whatever, whereas Lincoln was. And though that wasn't, I don't think that was Lincoln's number one thing. When he was running for office, he wasn't saying anything about freeing the slaves. He was just, like, that ended up happening because the country was divided.
Yeah, and it took a long time. This whole weird switch where Republicans became Democrats and to a large percentage, and Democrats became Republicans, it really got galvanized through the civil rights movement. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, we see that kind of switch happen. But, like, my point is, as a Muslim, you have to be willing to challenge yourself and your tribe. The Quran says, be firmly standing up for justice. A very similar the ayah we mentioned before from Surah Al-Ma'idah, this one's in Surah Al-Nisa, وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ وَالْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ. Stand up firmly for justice for God's sake, even if it be against yourselves or your parents or your family members. So that was being revealed to a tribal society that was very, very rigidly tribal. So they used to say, "Ansur akhaka zaliman wa mazluman." They used to say that in ancient poetry. Support your brother in the tribe, whether he's oppressor or the oppressed. And so they took that literally, meaning we don't get all moral high ground when it comes to supporting our tribe. We support our tribe, period. Right? And that's how we see with the Republicans right now. But you also see with the Democrats to a large extent, you know, in terms of mainstream or centrist Democrats. You know, corporate Democrats, they call them, a lot of them call them Dixiecrats, Joe Manchin and all them, you know, they're calling to this. So for a Muslim, you know, it's very important to question things and look at the full moral integrity and then place it in the lens of Quran and Sunnah in terms of how we judge things, right? أَن تَحْكُمُوا بِالْعَدْلِ. You must judge between situations or people in justice and fulfill your trust in knowledge. You know, the idea of carrying knowledge and passing it on and promoting what is right. What is right is obviously something encouraged in the Quran and the Hadith, but it's also what we see is not really talked about Quran and Hadith, but we see the benefits of it versus the harm. So that would be munkar. We would go against. So when we see harmful things, we shouldn't feel shy because people around us. There's a difference between standing for something and there's another thing about trying to avert people's rights. Everybody has rights, even in an Islamic context, theocratically. But in America, obviously where we live, we respect everybody's rights here. We're a minority group and we're just, you know, going along with the system that has been offered us, and it's a very effective system for us to be the best Muslims we can be. So we're not going to sit, well, there's many Americans who say, you know, Islam is bad, we don't want Muslims here following Islam, right? So that taking away of rights, we're against that, right? So, but to say, you know, I'm not against these people or those people or this political position or that. I'm not against the person's right, but the moral, actual reality of it, I'm going to challenge it in terms of the effect of the actions or the policy.
It reminds me of this statistic I saw, and I'm not sure like how accurate it was. I think it was from HuffPost, I think, and they were saying that in 2015, when Trump became president, 70% of Republicans said that they were not comfortable with Islam. So, yeah.
And what's interesting is you saw how it's all just smoke and mirrors. It's all a game. In terms of getting elected on the heels of the San Bernardino massacre, he wanted to get elected. And he said things like Islam hates us and all this. But once he was elected, and then he was invited, his whole entire administration was invited to Saudi Arabia. And he went there doing the orb thing with whatever that was, where the glowing ball that they were all holding, and had a map on a big screen. And he made multi-billion-dollar deals with them. And you'll see, right after that, you heard no Islamophobic stuff from Trump. He didn't go on that at all.
Didn't mention the awkward handshake.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so well, we found our like a bit far away from the original event, but I find it interesting, like the points you made about morality and politics in relation to Islam. So I actually wanted to ask a question. And so you've told me in the past that like living in a secular country, we need to follow the secular laws, right? And so when we're looking at laws and legislation that's being passed, we shouldn't look at it from a lens of Islamic law, but instead of secular law, right? That everyone has the same equal rights or whatever. So we judge it by this country's current laws, like the Constitution, Bill of Rights and whatnot. So, but how does this apply to like moral issues, right? So like abortion, like in Islam, if there isn't like a valid reason, right, for abortion, then you can't do it, even if it's like less than either, was it 40 or 120 days? I think that's called.
The majority position is less than 120 days.
Right. So then like, but you can't control that, right? So like, would getting rid of it altogether as a moral like decision be better, or would letting everyone do it as like a secular freedom decision be better? Because at that point, you're not making a decision just like in terms of like the secular government, you're making a decision based on your like moral standing, right?
Yeah. So this becomes a whole nother thing. Maybe we can have a whole nother series on this, but if I was to really sum up, because for lack of time here, I would say that for a Muslim, always divine law comes first. You know, and for an individual as me and you, if I'm saying that there is no deity and nothing worthy of worship except for God alone, and I'm saying that Muhammad is his final messenger, his servant that he sent to be an example for us of his word, then of course that is supreme. That's the divine law that goes above and beyond everything, and that is the way that our morality is. Now, that being said, should I try to superimpose those moral things on other people living as a 2% at max, best case scenario of the entire society? Should I expect the 98% to somehow follow or like or to go along with the Islamic morality? No, because the Quran is very clear, la ikraha fid din. There's no compulsion in religion. We shouldn't be trying to do that. So in terms of abortion specifically, there is a whole nuance. I think the way you presented it was a little bit I think we could go really deep into this issue.
I tried to boil it down.
Yeah, and so it depends on which law and how, if you're voting on it or if you're being asked about it in terms of public policy. At the end of the day, right, you talk about things like abortion or LGBT, for example. At the end of the day, we have our religion, we're teaching it. If they start telling us we have to have an abortion or we have to perform this type of a marriage, now here's where it becomes an issue to fight, right? And when we say fight, obviously we're talking about in the context we live in and what that is.
Gotta provide
of course,
that
for some stupid reason, I have to make that caveat. But in terms of should we campaign against the clear majority, and when we say majority, there is actually a majority of people who are registered Republican who actually are fine with the gay marriage and all that stuff, as well as the abortion. Because what happens is your religion plays a big role, for this, whatever. And then all of a sudden your daughter's pregnant at 14. You have a different view that pops up, right? And so, this is a big discussion. So when we're talking about a majority of people and what that means to them, it's like right now people are asking about marijuana legalization. Obviously, as a Muslim, we don't take part in any drugs or recreational highs or whatever. But if we say, okay, what does the legalization amount to? What is the harm that it will remove? What is the benefit it will gain? And do the majority of the people support that, right? So when we look at that and we look at the big picture, because like at the end of the day, there's Muslim kids running around smoking weed now and it's illegal, right? And I can tell you, because I try to counsel them, it's very available. It is as available as you can. If you wanted weed and you're a kid right now, you're going to go get high. And you don't need Ilhan Omar to approve of your morality before you will go, oh, and now she said, so now I'm going to. I don't think anybody thinks that way. I really think that's an unfair burden that we're putting on her or Mujtaba or whoever else in their capacity as an elected leader representing people who voted for them, right? I mean, it's one thing to say this is completely harmful and wrong. It's another thing to say freedom of, decision and religion. And then we look at the prison systems, the criminal justice system, and what they have done with people who were smoking weed and having weed, particularly if you were black or brown. And then if you legalized it, what that would do to relieve so many people of prison, right? As well as stopping other people's whole lives being ruined because of something that actually, if we're really honest, and I was not always Muslim, the high of weed is way less of a problem than the drunkenness of alcohol. In terms of your own morality and moral decision-making process, you'll see much more problems and lots of deaths from just drinking too much or making a terrible decision while drinking versus marijuana. You find almost none.
Better regulated than,
Yeah, because that's what they're seeing. They're seeing that different drugs and pesticides and things are in this marijuana that they're getting in the street, and that's causing all kind of problems.
But where does that end? Better regulated than just out there and illegal. Like, we can't have just like Class A drugs. Like
There's an interesting Columbia professor. I was reading this thing and I was blown out of my mind. He is on Facebook and Twitter as a professor in Columbia. I'm trying to remember what is his actual, but he wrote a book on legalizing all drugs, and he says publicly and openly, periodically, I'll have a couple of lines of heroin to go to sleep at night, and I don't see a problem with this. So I think this guy, he can bring all kind of liberal talking points of freedom and responsibility that so many people may have or whatever. But when you look at the lives that have been destroyed from this drug and from other drugs like it, it's obvious, So as Muslims, that's how we look at it. We look at the harm that's caused by it. And the divine law prioritizes prohibitions based upon the harm.
But then can't that same logic be applied to weed then? Because a lot of people destroy their lives, become potheads or whatever. And
I would say that's not a very common thing. Number one, what weed does to you. And trust me, before I was Muslim, I ran with guys that smoked a lot of weed. And so what it happens to you, and then your ability to get out of weed smoke. And then weed as a gateway drug is true because of the black market. I know I sound like some hardline Republican now, but I just stick with facts, as we've talked about this whole entire episode. In the black market, it's very common for everybody to have access to weed. But you'd have to find the right dealer who also knew somebody who has meth or coke or ecstasy or whatever, heroin and those things. But you would use your weed connections to find this thing, right? But if weed is no longer, which is, by the way, I think they're saying 64% of the people in the country say not only do they support, they have actually smoked marijuana in the last month. Right? So adult people are smoking weed. It's just a reality in this society. A lot of people don't realize how common it is.
If we legalize it, should we normalize it? That's another,
of course not
from
normalized.
An Islamic perspective.
The ruling stays the same no matter what for a Muslim. And that's where we talk about the difference. So we already live here and alcohol is legal, right? If you're a Muslim, you know alcohol is haram. Just because I would like to see the data, because I'm going to guess that a very, very, very small percent of people who act. So then also we have to have a whole nother discussion about what's a Muslim and this whole ethnic cultural identification of religions. And I can see the Christian community is really breaking down and doing this. And so they've gone from 81% to 62% in 20 years.
What, sorry?
The Christian community in America is now down to 62%. Because they're doing the data polls in which do you identify as a Christian, right? And that has gone down massively, right? I think if you had a blind poll for many Muslims, and so that's the thing, is that many people are seeing Islam as like a family culture thing, right? They're not seeing it as a conviction of principles that you believe in the infallibility of a revelation sent to Prophet Muhammad and the need to follow his example.
And that's how they're able to like correlate a bunch of different like atrocities with Islam, because they view it as like some culture or whatever. Like, I believe like they, like, what are some examples of some things that people will correlate to Islam even though they're a part of a culture?
So the king empires that even some Muslim romanticized historians or whatever wannabe Islamists or whatever are saying those were caliphates. I mean, if we're honest, when we say caliphate in terms of an actually theocratically governed top to bottom thing, according to the Prophet Muhammad, according to history, you're not going to get more than 100 years of that, right? So in terms of our 1400 years, 1300 years plus, in terms of who is the final authority, the ruler, is mostly kings. And his position has very little to do with faithful logistical qualifications, and it has much more to do with him being in the family and having a position of closeness to the guy who died before him.
And I believe, like, I'm not
so
very,
they did do some murderous and even conversions, which is weird because even though it's totally against Quran and Sunnah, but they just saw that as just like the Roman Empire. You know, it was like, well, the greatness of the Romans is being Christian, and so wiping out all of these non-Christians or telling them you better convert or else, you know. So you don't see it as common because of the very obvious scriptural teachings that are against that type of a thing. But it did happen, and so they associate it with Islam and Muslims because the guy who was calling the shots, the governor or the king, the governor, or the general, made some decisions that were violent.
And I think that to wrap this up and bring it right back to the original point, if we see one person of a certain religion or like of a certain group do something horrible, we shouldn't lump together that entire group and put them all in the same box.
Yeah, so if we say, okay, let's look at Buddhism, right? Buddhism has beautiful teachings, and you cannot relate what Myanmar has done. But I've heard Muslims saying, yeah, we see Buddhist violence in Myanmar. That's totally wrong. This is not Buddhist violence. This is nationalist Myanmar violence, and they co-opt the Buddhist identity in order to make people feel like, you know...
The same thing can be said about India, like it's Hindu nationalists, but then do we blame Hinduism? No, we don't. Because
if you look at, you know, the scriptural teachings of Hinduism in terms of personal spirituality and how you treat others, I mean, there's a large history of India. It's huge. It's, you know, they did not really go on imperial domination type things ever. They weren't really into that. They have their own giant land where they all come from, and there's been some internal stuff. But for the most part, the spiritual tradition is very reflective and meditative and not harmful to, you know, that's why they all adopted after Buddha took that strong measure against killing all life. So that's when if you look back at the history, I read this whole thing that the Hindu people were not all against, they weren't vegetarian until Buddha did that, but then they saw that Buddha really has highlighted certain things that they have in their spiritual tradition, but eating meat is tasty and all of that, and they just avoided the beef because of Hare Krishna and the teaching about cows and things like that.
Right, and then also we should look at matters for what they are and just try to take stuff from that.
There's a principle in Islamic belief system and principle of how we judge. He said, "Nahkum ala ash-shay' ala zahirihi." We judge something on what we know from it. We cannot go into intentions or secret motivations. I mean, it's true. The science of racism and the environmentally biased conditioning of racism is permeating in this society. There's no question about that, right? But to start blaming a whole mass murder on that very real reality probably all of us have to a degree or a level, I think is just un-Islamic and unprincipled.
Right. I was just thinking of like when it initially happened, and I actually told my dad about this, that like I was like, I hope it's not like some Muslim person, right? And I was like kind of scared because every single time such a thing happens, then usually like Islamophobia goes up. Not really for myself, alhamdulillah, I have not really encountered much of that, but it's more just for the general like Islam itself, right? It's just like the opinion. Well, while the opinion doesn't matter, like the view that people have of it, right? It sours. Yeah. You know? So, but then, like, I find it interesting that this was, like, one of the first attacks or whatever that was done by a Muslim. And as you said, like, the mass media they didn't call it terrorism or whatever. They just called it murder. Like,
even Fox News, they didn't talk about him being Muslim or even Arab or Middle Eastern. They just simply said his name. And they did say he's been here most of his life. His family came from Syria. But that was clearly a factual, journalistic reporting versus what we saw from Fox News before. So we're definitely blessed to be moving in the right direction about a reasonable judgment of Muslims who unfortunately happen to do terrible things.
And it reminds me, I don't remember what the exact verse is, but it's the one where it's like, and they plan, but Allah is the best of planners or whatever. So I find it interesting that we might not know what's going on or like why something's happening, but then like there's just something. It's just the grand scheme of things.
Right.
Right. So I guess that'll be it. That'll wrap it up for today. Inshallah. Thank you for your time. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khairan.